In the September episode of Atlas Applied, we touched on the definition of life and how that relates to the conversation surrounding abortion. Today, we're focusing mainly on the question, what is life? The main theme of this video, which we'll see once we get started, is that life is easy to identify, but extremely hard to define. First thing, when we're talking about life, we have to understand that life is an emergent property. Life isn't inherent to an organelle, it isn't inherent to the cell. It's the collective working of all these different things inside the cell that's giving it life. However, a definition like that is extremely ambiguous. We could bring up the example of machinery. How about a car? A car, the collective working of all these different parts, once you turn it on, it runs. It's kind of alive, but nobody's arguing that cars are actually living things. So we're really going to have to pinpoint our definition here. And if you're familiar with biology in any way, if you took it throughout high school, you'll probably remember a few of these characteristics of life. And there's 6 of them. The first one is reproduction. Reproduction, however, can't be a necessary condition. We take the example of mules or worker ants or tons of different varieties of garden plants that don't reproduce. I like the mule example especially because it's very well known. Everybody knows that mules can't have mule babies. And when we look at that, if we're abiding by the definition that an animal has to be able to reproduce, or an organism has to be able to reproduce, then a mule wouldn't be alive. But that's absurd to say that. Mules are alive. There's no question. Number 2 is evolution. Many animals, like crocodiles, for example, haven't evolved for hundreds of millions of years. However, nobody's arguing that crocodiles aren't alive. If we use evolution as a parameter for our definition, then we have to come up with some sort of time frame where if you haven't evolved in 10 million years, for example, or no noticeable evolution in 100 million years, then you're no longer considered a living thing. But even that sounds kind of absurd. Crocodiles are alive. Number 3 is sensitivity. Sensitivity is a common one that relates to response to stimulus. But we can use many different animals and organisms as examples that don't fit that criteria of responding to sensitivity. One of them could be humans in comas, for example. A human in a coma is not going to be responsive to your voice, to your touch, really to anything in that sort of situation. However, does that constitute the verdict that they're not alive? No, everybody knows that people in comas are alive. Number 4 is metabolism. And now, traditionally, metabolism is kind of defined as a characteristic that is used to define life by using life. So it ends up being kind of a circular argument of what metabolism is. We're going to touch back on that towards the end of the video because I think metabolism does give us the best shot at figuring out what the definition of life is. Number 6 is organization and complexity. These are number 5 and 6, organization and complexity. Both are very vague. They're too vague to really constitute as necessary criteria for our definition. Various machinery, for example, are extremely complex and extremely organized. You can use your car or a boat or whatever. Extremely, they fit both of those criteria and they're not alive. So that wraps up the 6 characteristics that we usually see in a biology class. And going through each individual one, we start to see that there's problems here with our original definition. We need to do some reconstructing. Many people have tried to do a lot with the definition of life, trying to figure out what it is. One is negative entropy. Entropy is the level of disorder in a system, so negative entropy would be more order. We all know that living organisms are ordered and they're fighting against entropy. But again, this is too broad. John Hands in his book Cosmos Sapiens brings up the example of a vortex, like in a swimming pool or something. The vortex is fighting against negative entropy, but again, it's not a living thing. So here we finally arrive at a definition of life that I think is extremely sufficient, although it may seem kind of broad. The more you pick it apart, the more it makes sense. And again, this is presented by John Hands in his book Cosmos Sapiens, but I've also added a few other things to it, or at least kind of comments on it, that really bring it all the way home for me as a good, solid definition for life. And I'll read it here. So the ability of a closed entity to respond to changes within itself and in its environment, to extract energy and matter from its environment, and to convert energy and matter into internally directed activity that includes maintaining its own existence. And under that definition, you could say that it has the potential to reproduce, the potential to evolve. This makes it so reproduction and evolution don't have to be in the exact definition, but they're still covered by the definition, if that makes sense. Again, as I mentioned previously, talking about metabolism, this sounds a lot like metabolism, and I think that's a good way of looking at it. He moves metabolism from this defining characteristic of life to a definition of what life is. On Friday's episode, we're actually going to be taking a look at all the different theories that attempt to answer the question, where did life come from? What's the origin of life? So you want to stay tuned for that and make sure to like and subscribe.